Before the first sunrise, before the first breath of wind stirred the surface of the deep, there was a silence that did not belong to creation. It was not the peace of something newly made, but the heavy stillness after something has been broken. The opening words of Genesis, words you have heard since childhood, announce with simplicity, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." But the very next verse refuses to match the picture of a perfect start. "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." This is not a world in the act of being born. This is a world already wounded. That phrase, "without form and void," is read so quickly, so softly, that most pass over it without thought. Yet in the ancient tongue of Moses, it is Tohu Va-Bohu, a combination so rare that it appears elsewhere only when the prophets describe the aftermath of divine judgment. Isaiah uses it to speak of a land laid waste. Jeremiah uses it to describe a world stripped bare by wrath. Never does it describe the raw material of a new creation. It is always the ruin left behind. And so a question rises, uninvited but unshakable, if this is not the beginning. Then what came before? For generations, teachers have assured us that Genesis 1 is the first act, and Genesis 1:2 is simply the blank canvas on which God will paint his masterpiece. But in the shadow of those verses, other voices whisper, in fragments of scrolls buried for millennia, in the testimony of books once read by Israel but now absent from most Bibles. There is another memory, a memory of an age before Adam, of a world already old before the first man was shaped from dust. The Book of Jubilees hints at it. The Book of Enoch lingers over it, and even the patterns of creation itself, its rhythms, its appointed times, suggest a story older than the garden. Imagine opening a book and finding that the first page has been carefully torn out. The remaining story still makes sense. The characters still live and speak. But there is a subtle wrongness, a sense that you have walked into a room where a conversation has just ended, and the air still carries the echo of what was said. Genesis 1:2 feels like that room. Something happened here, something the canonical text passes over in a breath. And perhaps that silence is deliberate. For if the darkness on the face of the deep is not the shadow before dawn, but the bruise after a blow, then we are not beginning with creation, we are beginning with aftermath. In that case, the story you have known all your life is not Act 1, it is Act 2. And we have stepped onto the stage after the first great conflict has already been fought. If that is true, then the fracture at the beginning is not a mystery of poetry, but the scar of history. And scars always have a story. Somewhere before the command, "Let there be light," there was a fall, a rebellion, a judgment. A world was unmade before it was made again. And the faint light we are about to see in verse 3 will rise over ruins far older than Adam. To step into the age before Adam is to walk into a land our modern maps cannot hold. Scripture, in its preserved form, leaves only a sliver of this realm visible, like a coastline glimpsed through fog. Yet in the ancient traditions of Israel, in the songs of prophets and the visions of seers, there is an older geography, a world not yet ours, yet intimately bound to our story. This was the first earth, the first heavens, the first arrangement of creation before it was shattered. The Book of Jubilees speaks of the beginning of the division of days and the ordering of times that predated the garden. It whispers of a creation that already had cycles, boundaries, and seasons, as if the stage had been set long before Adam walked upon it. In this telling, the earth was not merely an empty canvas awaiting paint. It was a house that had been built, inhabited, and then stripped bare. The Book of Enoch hints further, describing the courts of heaven and the watchers stationed over the nations, as though the fabric of creation was woven with both seen and unseen rulers before humanity's rise. Imagine valleys where rivers of light, not water, once flowed. Imagine mountains whose foundations were not rock, but something luminous, like crystal thrones set upon the deep. Picture cities of spirit real, solid, yet untouched by decay, where the servants of the Most High carried out their appointed tasks. These are not fantasies of the imagination. They are echoes of descriptions preserved in fragments, in the liturgy of the earliest believers, and in the coded poetry of the Psalms. Before the mountains were brought forth, Moses wrote in Psalm 90, "From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Such words do not only look backward into eternity, they glance toward a tangible world that existed before the current one took form. Yet this first world did not remain untouched. The traditions speak of a breach, a defilement, a rebellion that did not begin in Eden, but somewhere higher. The prophet Isaiah describes the earth mourning and withering, as though something catastrophic had swept across both land and sky. Jeremiah, in his lament, uses the same phrase as Genesis 1:2, Tohu Va-Bohu, as he surveys a world laid waste by divine anger. These are not the birth pangs of a planet, they are the death throes of one already alive. And then silence. A silence not of peace, but of judgment served and sentence carried out. The world that was became the world that is, but only after it was stripped of memory. The inhabitants of this earlier creation are not named in Genesis. Their cities are not mapped. Their fall is not recounted in the open text. Yet like the faint scent of smoke lingering long after a fire is quenched, the remnants of that world still cling to the opening lines of our Bible. Why was it erased? Perhaps because to name it would be to confront the war that scarred it. To remember it would be to remember those who defied the Most High and were cast down. And perhaps, in his wisdom, God chose to seal that memory until the appointed time. But the erased land is not gone, it is simply veiled. The records in Jubilees, Enoch, and other ancient writings pull at the edges of that veil, offering us glimpses. This is the land erased from memory, a realm that knew the voice of God before we did, a creation that sang his praises before Adam's lungs filled with breath. To glimpse it is to realize that our story is not the first story. We are heirs to a world already ancient when we began. And if the first world could fall, so can the second. It is a phrase that drifts past the modern reader like a cloud, mysterious, shapeless, and gone before the mind can hold it. The earth was without form and void. In Hebrew, Tohu Va-Bohu, 2 words, ancient as the first scrolls, carrying the weight of a mystery too easily flattened into translation. To English ears, they sound poetic, harmless. But in the ears of Israel, These words rang like the echo of a verdict. The first, Tohu, means more than formless. In Isaiah 45:18, the prophet records that God did not create it Tohu. He formed it to be inhabited. Tohu is the antithesis of God's purpose. It is desolation, waste, the aftermath of something unmade. In Deuteronomy 32:10, Moses describes God finding Jacob in a desert land, in the Tohu, a place of barrenness and danger. It is a word for places abandoned by order, where life cannot root itself. The second, Bohu, appears even more rarely, and always as the shadow of Tohu. In Jeremiah 4:23, the prophet sees in vision the earth, and behold, it was Tohu Va-Bohu, and the heavens had no light. He is not describing the first dawn, he is watching the lights go out. This coupling of words is never neutral, never benign. It marks the stage after a calamity, the silence after a decree of judgment has swept the land. So when Moses penned Genesis 1:2, guided by the Spirit, and chose Tohu Va-Bohu, he was not crafting a delicate poetic flourish. He was invoking the language of ruin. The earth, at the moment before let there be light, stood not as an empty workshop awaiting the carpenter, but as a once finished structure now gutted by fire. Ancient interpreters recognize this weight. The sages of Israel pondered why the Most High, who does all things in order, would begin his revelation with a scene of disorder. Their conclusion was unsettling. This was not the beginning of God's work, but the beginning of his work again. Something had been before. It had collapsed under judgment, and now he would set it right. The early church fathers, too, wrestled with the phrase, some hinting at worlds before ours, others guarding the mystery in silence. The Book of Jubilees, though not explicit in naming the Tohu Va-Bohu, surrounds it with the implication of cosmic rearrangement. It speaks of the division of the days and the reordering of creation's boundaries, as if the clock had been reset after an unspeakable disruption. The Book of Enoch adds the detail of rebellious beings, watchers, whose defiance brought chaos into an ordered creation. In both accounts, disorder is never random. It is the fruit of rebellion. Consider what this means. The Bible's first scene is not a void waiting to be filled, but a courtroom after sentence has been carried out. The darkness covering the face of the deep is not the night before morning, but the shroud after burial. The Spirit hovering over the waters is not a leisurely artist contemplating his work, but a rescuer surveying the wreckage before beginning the restoration. This changes everything. If Tohu Va-Bohu marks judgment past, then the 6 days of creation that follow are not merely an act of making, but an act of redeeming. The light is not the first light ever lit. It is the return of light to a world that once knew it and lost it. The sea is not being given its boundaries. For the first time it is being restrained after it has overrun them. Creation, in this light, is not a simple start. It is a restoration project born from the ashes of an earlier world. Why does this matter? Because a God who begins his word with redemption is a God whose nature is to restore. Before Adam sinned, before Israel wandered, before Christ came to the cross, the pattern was already set: ruin, then redemption, darkness, then light. And in that ancient pattern we find the first shadow of the gospel itself. We have been taught to open Genesis with the reverence one reserves for a first page, the first brushstroke on a blank canvas, in countless pulpits and children's classrooms. The creation story is presented as the dawn of everything, the undisputed start of both time and history. The first day, the first light, the first man. But what if the first day in Genesis is not the first day at all? What if it is the first day after something else, something older, stranger, and far more devastating has already ended? The moment we recognize Tohu Va-Bohu as the language of ruin. The ground shifts under our feet. The narrative we thought was the beginning reveals itself as the recovery of a world struck down. What most consider Act 1 is, in truth, Act 2. And as in any play where you enter halfway through, there are characters you do not know, conflicts you have not witnessed, and a silence where the first act's closing lines should be. The canonical Genesis account offers no direct commentary on what preceded. It moves with solemn purpose from chaos to light, from water to land, from seed to fruit. But the silences between its lines are wide enough to contain the fall of thrones. The prophets, when their visions pierce the veil, sometimes let slip images that belong to another time, stars cast down from heaven. Nations that have no place among Adam's children. A serpent whose malice predates Eden itself. Books beyond the canon speak more freely. Jubilees tells of an ordered creation in the hands of appointed watchers, heavenly guardians tasked to safeguard the appointed times. Enoch speaks of councils in heaven, of boundaries set for angels and men alike, and of those who crossed them. Even the ancient Near Eastern traditions outside Israel echo a half-memory of worlds remade tales of floods and wars in heaven, of primeval cities swallowed by judgment. These are not copies of the biblical account. They are fractured reflections of a truth so deep it rippled across cultures. Why would this first act be left untold in our primary scriptures? Perhaps because the Holy Spirit chose to center the story on us, on humanity's covenant and redemption. Perhaps because the full telling of the war before our war would crush our small sense of history under its weight. Or perhaps because the reality of such a conflict, angels falling, realms unmade, was meant to be uncovered only by those willing to search beyond the familiar. Understanding Genesis as Act 2 changes the way we read its every word. Light becomes not just creation, but restoration. The separation of waters becomes an act of mercy, reclaiming boundaries once violated. Humanity's placement in Eden is not simply the gift of a home, but the entrusting of a world already scarred, now to be guarded. We are not the first occupants of creation. We are its inheritors after an untold calamity. And if our story begins in the shadow of a greater one, then our role is not only to live in God's design, but to carry forward the war of loyalty that began before we were born. The serpent in Eden is no ordinary tempter. He is a survivor of the first act, still pursuing the same rebellion that wrecked the earlier world. His presence in the garden is proof that the curtain may have risen on a new scene, but the enemy from Act 1 still walks the stage. If this is Act 2, then what was Act 1? What was the nature of that rebellion? Who were its players? And what law did they break to merit the unmaking of a world? To answer that, we must follow the trail of the Watcher's beings who once bore the authority of heaven. yet whose footsteps now lead straight into the shadows of betrayal. The story of the fracture before Adam might seem like an ancient curiosity, a piece of forgotten cosmic history with no bearing on the present. But the echo of that first ruin has never stopped reverberating. It hums beneath the surface of our age, the way a struck bell continues to sing long after the hand that struck it is gone. What happened before Genesis 1:3 is not merely prologue, it is a pattern, and patterns repeat. In the first world, a perfect order was established. Boundaries were drawn between light and darkness, between heaven's authority and the realm entrusted to its guardians. Appointed times were set in place, cycles of days, seasons, and jubilees that kept creation in harmony with its creator. This was not ritual for ritual's sake. It was the architecture of reality. When those appointed to keep it betrayed their calling, the very structure of creation buckled. Chaos rushed in like a tide. Judgment followed like a storm. Look around now. We live in an age where boundaries blur again. The sacred is treated as common. The rhythms of time once ordered to honor the Creator are bent to human convenience and market demand. The watchers of our own age, whether spiritual or human, abandon their posts, drawn away by power, desire, or pride. The parallels are more than metaphor. They are a warning. The prophets saw this echo. Isaiah spoke of a day when the earth would stagger like a drunkard under the weight of its defilement. Jesus himself warned that the end of the age would mirror the days of Noah, when the lines between the holy and the profane were erased. The Apostle Paul described a mystery of lawlessness already at work, a current that began long before the first century and will not be restrained forever. The erased land of the first world is not just a historical puzzle, it is a mirror held up to our own time. We too live between acts. Our own Act 1 was Christ's resurrection, the decisive victory that began the restoration of all things. Our Act 2 is the present age, where the enemy remains at large, seeking to repeat his old sabotage before the final curtain falls. The difference is that now, the stakes are eternal for every soul. Understanding the pre-Adamic ruin forces us to see history not as a straight line, but as a cycle creation. Rebellion, judgment, restoration, each iteration drawing closer to a final reckoning. If the first ruin ended in unmaking and remaking, what will the last echo bring? The Book of Revelation hints at a time when heaven and earth will be remade once more, not because God failed, but because his justice demands the purging of every trace of rebellion. We are living in the resonance of that first bell strike. The same hand that rebuilt the world after Tohu Va-Bohu is at work now, gathering a people who will stand when the next upheaval comes. The choice before us is the same one that faced the first guardians: remain in covenant with the Creator, or fracture the order entrusted to us. The echo will not fade until the final word is spoken. And that word will either welcome us into a new creation or shut us out into the darkness that covered the face of the deep. Before the flood, before the covenant with Noah, before Abraham heard the voice calling him out of Ur, there was another assignment given not to men, but to beings older and stronger than men. They are called watchers in the Book of Jubilees, Grigori in certain ancient traditions, angels who sinned in the brief but piercing words of the Apostle Peter. Their origin is not among us. They were born in the heights, in the courts where the glory of the Most High shone without shadow. The Creator, in His wisdom, appointed them as guardians over the earth and its early inhabitants. They were to instruct humanity in righteousness, to safeguard the appointed times, and to preserve the harmony between heaven and earth. In this role they were not ornamental, they were essential. For mankind, still new to the soil, did not yet know the patterns of God's order. We were a race of children learning to speak, to plant, to build altars. The Watchers were our elder brothers, tasked to guide and protect. Jubilees speaks of their descent in the days before Noah, when they came down in the days of Jared and walked openly among men. Their presence was not a secret. They bore the brightness of their origin, and their authority was recognized without question. Imagine the awe of our ancestors, standing before beings whose voices carried the weight of thunder, whose faces bore the light of the stars. In those days, the boundary between heaven and earth was not yet sealed. The guardians walked the fields, sat at the gates of cities, and instructed tribes in the keeping of God's calendar, a 364-day cycle that aligned the rhythms of earth with the throne above. This calendar was no small matter. In the ancient understanding, time itself was part of the covenant. To keep the appointed times was to remain in harmony with creation's design. To abandon them was to drift into disorder, to invite the chaos that had once destroyed the earlier world. The Watcher's task was to ensure that never happened again. They were the keepers of the divine clock, the ones who would sound the alarm if the world began to turn against its Creator's appointed order. But authority is a dangerous gift, and proximity to humanity brought with it a temptation even heaven's messengers were not immune to. The Book of Enoch records how the eyes of the Watchers fell upon the daughters of men, and desire began to grow where only duty had been. It was a desire not only for beauty, but for dominion, for the right to shape humanity after their own will, to mix the seed of heaven with the seed of earth. In this subtle shift, the Guardians' mission began to warp. Even before their rebellion was full, there were signs. Some began teaching knowledge not entrusted to them to give arts of war, enchantments, and the secrets of the stars twisted towards self-rule rather than worship. The trust between heaven and earth was thinning, like ice beginning to crack under unseen pressure. They had been sent down to guard, but the seeds of their downfall were already taking root. And when the line between protector and predator is crossed, the order of creation itself trembles. What began as a commission from the Most High was about to become the gravest breach since the rebellion that ended the first world. In the Book of Jubilees, the Creator's order is not only written in stone tablets or inscribed in the memory of angels, it is woven into the very fabric of time. The text speaks repeatedly of the appointed times, a sacred framework of days, weeks, months, and years that runs like the heartbeat of creation. This was not a human invention. It was a heavenly pattern revealed and entrusted to both the righteous among men and the holy ones set to guard them. The divine calendar, as preserved in Jubilees, is precise 364 days divided into equal quarters, each marking the turn of seasons and the cycle of festivals appointed by God. It is a calendar that never drifts, for it is aligned not to the waxing and waning of the moon, but to the unchanging paths of the sun and the stars. In this rhythm, every feast, every Sabbath, every Jubilee year falls exactly where it should, year after year. To live by this order was to dwell in harmony with the Creator's will. To abandon it was to step outside the covenant's boundaries. The Watchers were not merely guards of humanity, they were custodians of this divine rhythm. Their charge was to ensure that the appointed times were kept, that each generation would know the sacred seasons and mark them in obedience. For in God's design, time itself was an altar. The right day, the right season, the right year, these were more than numbers. They were moments when heaven and earth aligned in purpose. But this sacred trust carried with it a warning to disrupt the appointed times, was to pull at the threads holding creation's order together. The Book of Jubilees warns that those who alter the calendar will confuse the seasons and profane the holy convocations, leading to a world where the appointed feasts are celebrated on the wrong days and the covenant rhythm is lost. This is not a minor error. It is the opening of a breach through which disorder and rebellion can pour in. And it was through this breach that the Watchers would fall, drawn by their desire for humanity's daughters and hungry for influence. They began to neglect the keeping of the times. Some passed on forbidden knowledge instead of teaching the sacred calendar. Others abandoned their posts entirely, leaving humanity to drift into patterns of time shaped by their own convenience, not by God's command. This shift was subtle at first. A feast moved by a single day, a Sabbath ignored for a marketplace bargain, the appointed year of release replaced with the endless toil of debt and labor. These were not only cultural changes, they were acts of covenant breaking, severing the link between heaven's order and earth's obedience. Once the divine rhythm was broken, other corruptions followed swiftly. Without the appointed times to anchor life, humanity became more vulnerable to the Watchers' influence. Laws bent, loyalties shifted. The order that once reflected the throne of heaven began to mirror the desires of fallen hearts. What the earlier rebellion had done to the first world, the Watchers' neglect was beginning to do to the second. The divine clock was being ignored, and the guardians entrusted with its care were stepping out of sync with the very Creator they once served. And when the appointed times are lost, the countdown to judgment begins quietly, invisibly, but inevitably. They descended in glory. They walked among men with the authority of heaven still on their brows. Their words carried the memory of the throne. Their steps stirred the dust of a world they were sworn to protect. Yet, in time, their eyes began to linger where they should not. The Watchers, guardians of the covenant order, turned their gaze from the appointed times to the daughters of men, and what began as a calling became a hunger. The Book of Enoch does not flinch in telling it. They saw them and desired them, and they said to one another, "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." This was no passing temptation. It was a decision made in council, sealed in a pact of defiance. On the slopes of Mount Hermon, they swore an oath together, a bond that bound them not to God's will, but to one another's rebellion. Desire was the spark, but pride was the fuel. The Watchers were not content to guide humanity. They wanted to shape it, to remake it in their own image. By taking wives from among mankind, they sought to fuse the glory of heaven with the flesh of earth, to create a lineage that bore the power of both realms. This union, forbidden by the Creator, produced the Nephilim giants in stature and in corruption, whose violence spread like a stain across the land. Their betrayal was not only in their marriages. The Watchers began to pour forbidden knowledge into human hands, knowledge that, in its proper place, belonged to the divine courts, but in mortal hands became instruments of ruin. They taught the crafting of weapons and the art of war. They revealed the enchantments of sorcery and the signs of the heavens, twisting them into tools of manipulation. They instructed in the making of jewelry and cosmetics, not as adornments of beauty, but as masks to stir vanity, lust, and rivalry. Every gift became a curse, every lesson a doorway to greater corruption. The appointed times, once the heartbeat of creation, were now ignored. Festivals meant to honor the Creator became spectacles to honor idols. The Sabbath rest became a day like any other, swallowed by the endless drive for power and gain. The seasons fell out of sync with the heavens, and humanity, once aligned with the Creator's rhythm, marched to the cadence of rebellion. It is easy to imagine the Watchers as monsters the moment they fell, but scripture and tradition paint a more chilling picture. They still bore the form of angels, still carried the glow of the heights, even as their hearts turned to darkness. This is the nature of deception. It wears the face of light while it sows the seeds of death. In their betrayal, the Watchers did not simply sin. They fractured the link between heaven and earth. They invited the chaos that had once unmade the earlier world to seep back in through the cracks they had opened. And as the Nephilim grew in number and strength, the violence of the earth reached a fever pitch. What had begun with a whisper on Mount Hermon would end in a roar heard across the heavens, a roar demanding judgment. The rebellion of the Watchers was not a moment. It was a contagion. And like any contagion, it would spread until the only cure left was the purging flood of God's justice. Before the rebellion of the Watchers, worship had a center. The Creator was honored according to his appointed times. Sacrifices were offered in their seasons, and the names of the Most High were spoken with awe. Humanity, though still young and fragile, lived under a canopy of truth that had not yet been torn. But the entry of the Watchers into our world changed the axis of devotion itself. At first, the shift was almost invisible. The Guardians still spoke of the heavens. They still used the language of blessing and power. But their instruction began to bend not in open contradiction to the Creator, but in subtle redirection. They taught that the forces of the sun, moon, and stars could be harnessed for personal gain. They claimed that certain rituals, timed not by God's calendar but by their own reckoning, would bring health, wealth, or victory in war. It was not long before the Creator's festivals were replaced by counterfeit observances, the true Sabbath eclipsed by days chosen for commerce or conquest. The most dangerous corruption was not the invention of new idols, but the distortion of true worship. Altars once dedicated to the Lord were repurposed to honor the names of the fallen. Songs that once celebrated the Creator's works now praise the deeds of the Nephilim, whose might was interpreted as divine favor. The giants were exalted as kings. Their cities became centers of trade and culture, and the stories of their exploits spread as if they were the rightful heirs of earth. Knowledge, too, became a weapon in this spiritual war. The Watchers' forbidden teachings: astrology, sorcery, the crafting of charms and amulets blended seamlessly into the daily life of the people. They no longer sought guidance from the one who made the stars, but from the patterns the Watchers told them to read in the constellations. They no longer prayed for rain to the God who sends it, but performed rites to manipulate the skies. The faith of man was no longer anchored in the covenant. It drifted on a tide charted by beings who had already forsaken their own first estate. This was the great deception. Humanity believed it was growing wiser, more powerful, more connected to the spiritual realm. In reality, it was being led into a covenant with rebellion itself. Every festival out of season, every altar to a false god, every union blessed by the Watchers instead of the Creator was a thread tying mankind to the same fate awaiting their angelic deceivers. In the Book of Jubilees, this distortion of faith is presented not merely as disobedience, but as a legal breach of contract. The covenant was written into the fabric of time and creation. To alter it was to break it, and when the covenant is broken, the protection it offers is lifted. The people of that age did not see it, but the moment they embraced the Watchers' distorted faith, they stepped outside the shelter of the Most High. And so the stage was set for judgment not only on earth, but in the heavens. For this was not merely a human failure, it was a heavenly betrayal that demanded a heavenly response. The distorted faith of man would bring the flood upon the land, but the rebellion of the Watchers would bring chains of darkness upon themselves. It would be easy to seal the story of the Watchers in the vault of ancient history, to treat their rebellion as a relic of a world long gone. But their fingerprints are not confined to the age before the flood. They linger in the cracks of our world, in the structures of belief, power, and culture that still bend away from the Creator's design. Their first legacy is the distortion of time. In the ancient days, altering the appointed times severed the link between heaven's rhythm and earth's obedience. Today, we have calendars that know nothing of the Creator's feasts, and rhythms of work and rest that bow to profit rather than to God's command. The year is marked by commercial seasons, political cycles, and the rise and fall of markets, each a drumbeat foreign to the divine order. We may not think of this as rebellion, but to the prophets, it would look hauntingly familiar. Their second legacy is the cult of forbidden knowledge. The Watchers fed humanity with wisdom not meant to be ours without the guidance of the Most High knowledge that became poison when severed from its source. That same appetite thrives in our age technologies without moral restraint. Sciences divorced from reverence, spiritual practices plucked from their original context and repackaged for personal empowerment. What the ancients called sorcery, we call self-actualization. The methods change, but the root is the same control apart from covenant. Their third legacy is the exaltation of power divorced from righteousness. In the pre-flood world, the Nephilim, offspring of the Watchers and human women, were celebrated for their might and feared for their violence. Today, we worship new giant celebrities, oligarchs, warlords, and cultural architects whose strength, wealth, or charisma allows them to rewrite the rules for everyone else. Their rise is often accompanied by moral collapse, yet they are still hailed as visionaries. In this, too, the shadow of the Watchers looms. Even the fascination with the heavens bears their mark. astrology, occultism, and the endless search for extraterrestrial life carry echoes of the first age's obsession with the knowledge of the stars. Humanity still looks upward, but too often not toward the throne of God. The sky becomes a mirror for our own ambitions, just as it was when the Watchers taught men to read it for power rather than for praise. The Book of Jubilees warns that these patterns are not harmless cultural quirks, they are fractures in the covenant fabric. Each one is a point of entry for the same chaos that swallowed the pre-flood world. The prophets understood this as more than metaphor. Daniel spoke of a final ruler who would change the times and the law, a direct echo of the Watchers' earliest crimes. Jesus himself tied the last days to the days of Noah, when the corruption of time, truth, and worship had reached a breaking point. To see the traces of the Watchers today is to recognize that the ancient war has never ended. The flood may have washed the giants from the earth, and chains of darkness may hold the rebel angels, but their influence, like a contagion, still moves through human history. And if the pattern is repeating, then the world is again approaching the point where the judge must step in to reset the order. This recognition is the bridge to the next part of our journey. For the judgment that fell in Noah's day was not a single act. It was two judgments layered together, one upon the earth and one upon the heavens. And if we understand how they came together, we will understand the warning God is sounding for us now. When most people picture the flood, they see it as an event entirely bound to earth-dark clouds swelling above, rain pouring down, rivers swelling into seas. But the scriptures tell a deeper story, one in which judgment descends not only on the soil and its inhabitants, but also on the heavens themselves. Genesis 7:11 records that on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The verse is often read as simple poetry, water from below, water from above. Yet the prophets and ancient writings hint at something more, that the opening of heaven's windows was not only a release of water, but a release of judgment from the throne of God. The Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch agree on this point. The flood was God's answer to a dual corruption. On earth, humanity's violence and the spread of the Nephilim had reached a fever pitch. In the heavens, the Watchers, those tasked to protect the appointed times, had abandoned their posts and defiled both earth and themselves. Two realms were under sentence. Two orders of beings were to be judged. This explains why the flood narrative is woven with threads of both cosmic and terrestrial imagery. The bursting of the great deep was more than the cracking of the earth's crust. It was the breaking of boundaries that had held since creation, an undoing of the separation established in Genesis chapter 1. The opening of the windows of heaven was more than meteorology. It was a signal that heaven itself was involved in this act of cleansing. Imagine it, the waters did not merely fall as rain. They roared from above like a deluge of divine wrath, each drop carrying the weight of a verdict. From below, the deep, once restrained by God's command, rose in rebellion against the land, swallowing cities, forests, and the proud towers of the Nephilim. The very architecture of the world seemed to turn against its corrupt inhabitants. And while the ark rose on the waters, another judgment was unfolding beyond human sight. The rebel Watchers, whose counsel had brought about this chaos, were seized. Enoch describes how the archangels bound them in chains, casting them into pits of darkness. to be held until the great day of final judgment. This was no symbolic act. It was a real imprisonment, a confinement in a realm far from the light of the throne they once served. The flood, then, was not merely nature's reset, it was heaven's purge. It was the simultaneous cleansing of the physical realm and the imprisonment of the spiritual conspirators who had defiled it. This is why Peter, in his epistle, can speak in the same breath of God not sparing the ancient world and of casting the angels who sinned into chains of gloomy darkness. The two events were part of one coordinated act of justice. To miss this is to miss the full weight of Noah's story. The ark was not only salvation from rising waters, it was deliverance from a collapsing cosmos, in which the unseen war between heaven and earth had reached its crisis. The waters rose from earth. Yes, but the verdict fell from heaven. The floodwaters may have erased the cities of men, but another tribunal was convening far above the rising waves. It was not held in a palace or a temple, but in the courts of the Almighty Himself, where no lie can stand and no defense can overturn the truth. Here the charges were read not against flesh and blood, but against those who once stood before the throne as loyal servants. The Watchers had been created to be messengers of light, keepers of the covenant order, and guardians of humanity's appointed times. They had walked among the stars, heard the unending worship around the sapphire throne, and seen the face of the one who dwells in unapproachable light. Yet they had traded that place for the dust of the earth, and worse, for the corruption of the very beings they had been sent to protect. Enoch's vision describes the moment of their sentencing in vivid terms. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel were summoned to carry out the decree. There would be no appeal, no long trial. The evidence was already carved into the ruin of the world below. Chains not forged by human hands were prepared bindings of darkness itself, a prison from which no power in creation could break free. One by one, the rebel watchers were seized. Whatever glory had once clothed them was stripped away, replaced by the shame of their defilement. Their voices, once instruments of praise, became cries that no longer reached the heavens. They were cast down, not into the sea or the depths of the earth, but into a realm described as the abyss, a place reserved for beings of their nature who have crossed the ultimate boundary. This was not annihilation. God did not erase them from existence, for their final judgment is yet to come. Instead, they were confined, their power removed, their influence on earth cut short. The imprisonment of the Watchers stands as one of the rare moments when heaven itself is cleansed, not because the throne was ever defiled, but because those who once stood in its courts had to be removed from their positions. Peter would later speak of this event to remind believers that God's justice is not limited to the affairs of men. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, he writes, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. His point is clear: the same God who judges the highest beings will surely judge the lowest. No position, however exalted, can shield the guilty from his verdict. The heavens, in this moment, were not weakened by the loss, they were purified. The rebellion had been exposed, the corruptors removed, and the order of God's realm upheld. But their imprisonment also served as a warning to the rest of creation. Heaven is not untouchable by discipline, and God's justice extends to every corner of his kingdom. While the earth groaned under the deluge and the ark rode upon the waters, this heavenly sentence was already complete. 2 realms, 2 judgments, 1 decree from the same throne. The flood was not just about the end of an age, it was about the restoration of order in heaven and on earth alike. 2 judgments, 2 realms, 1 verdict. The flood and the chaining of the watchers are not separate stories stitched together. They are a single declaration, delivered in 2 theaters of creation. Together, they reveal a truth as old as the first act of rebellion when the order of God's kingdom is shattered. Judgment falls on every participant, whether clothed in mortal flesh or robed in celestial light. The flood was the visible warning. Men could see the black clouds gather, hear the first drops fall, feel the rising water claw at their doors. It was tangible, undeniable, inescapable. The imprisonment of the watchers, on the other hand, was invisible to human eyes, but no less real. It was a heavenly counterpart, a demonstration that God's justice operates in realms we cannot see, with precision we cannot evade. This twofold judgment answers an unspoken question that has haunted humanity for ages. Will those in higher positions, be they rulers, priests, or even angels, escape the justice that falls on the rest of us? In Noah's day, the answer was written in water and sealed in chains. No. If God did not spare those who walked in his courts, he will not spare those who trample his covenant on earth. The double warning also exposes the root cause of both judgments, the breaking of appointed boundaries. Humanity crossed into violence and corruption, erasing the line between holy and profane. The watchers crossed into forbidden desire and authority, erasing the line between heaven's servants and earth's sons. Both crossed a threshold they could never uncross, and in doing so, they brought ruin not only upon themselves, but upon the order entrusted to them. Prophetically, this dual pattern still stands as a warning to the last days. Jesus himself linked the final generation to the days of Noah, when earth's corruption and heaven's rebellion reached a tipping point. The book of Revelation shows these 2 arenas again, judgment falling on the kingdoms of men and the dragon and his angels being cast out of heaven. It is the same structure, 2 realms, 1 decree. For the believer, the double warning carries both fear and comfort. Fear, because it reminds us that nothing, neither rank nor secrecy, can shield us from God's gaze. Comfort, because it assures us that every wrong, no matter how hidden or exalted the perpetrator, will face the same justice. There is no corruption too high to escape his reach, no rebellion too distant to evade his summons. The ark, riding above the waters, stands as the counterpart to the faithful angels who remained loyal in the courts of heaven. Both were preserved, both emerged into a cleansed world, both became the foundation for the order that followed. And so the pattern repeats. Those who keep covenant will be carried through. Those who break it will be cut off, whether their dwelling is on earth or in the heights. The double warning is clear. God's justice is whole. It moves through every realm with equal force. To ignore it is to pretend the flood never happened, to imagine the watchers still walk freely among us. But to heed it is to understand the unshakable truth that the one who judged then is the same one who will judge again. When the floodwaters finally receded and the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, the world must have seemed utterly new. The air was clean, the soil washed, the violence silenced. Every trace of the old cities lay buried beneath layers of silt and stone. To Noah and his family, it must have felt like the page had been wiped clean forever. Yet Scripture and the history that follows makes it clear that not everything had been erased. Some traces of the pre-flood corruption endured. Genesis 6:4 contains a haunting phrase, almost easy to miss. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That afterward hangs in the air like an echo. It tells us that the bloodline born of the Watchers' rebellion did not vanish completely with the flood. How this remnant survived is a mystery. Scripture does not spell out in detail. Theories abound. Perhaps the corruption re-entered through a renewed descent of fallen beings, as some traditions hold. Perhaps it persisted in the blood of one of the wives aboard the ark. Whatever the means, the outcome is the same. The Nephilim legacy continued. By the time Israel began its conquest of Canaan, the memory of these beings had hardened into fear. The spies sent into the land reported, "We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Numbers 13:33. These were the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim giant clans whose stature and strength echoed the ancient hybrids before the flood. Their presence was not merely a military challenge, it was a spiritual provocation. A reminder that the rebellion of the Watchers still cast its shadow over the promised land. The persistence of this bloodline after such a sweeping judgment underscores a sobering truth. Even when God wipes the slate clean, the human heart and the spiritual realm remain battlegrounds. Evil is not always eradicated by a single act of judgment. It must be resisted continually. The flood was not the final blow against the rebellion. It was a decisive strike, but the war would go on. The survival of the Nephilim legacy also served as a test for the generations to come. Would they confront it with the covenant faithfulness of Noah, or shrink back in fear as the first generation of spies did? Would they recognize in these giants not merely an enemy of flesh and blood, but the manifestation of an ancient spiritual conflict that began before Adam? The prophets saw this continuity. Amos spoke of the Amorites, whose height was like the height of cedars, and yet who fell under God's judgment. The psalmists celebrated the defeat of Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed was over 13 feet long, as proof of God's enduring power to drive out even the most imposing foes. These stories are not just accounts of military victory. They are reminders that the war against the Watchers' legacy did not end when the rain stopped. Even now, the concept of the Nephilim persists not always in literal giants, but in the enduring human fascination with power beyond the human, with crossing boundaries God has set. Whether through science, occultism, or cultural mythology, the spirit of that rebellion still seeks vessels, and as it was in those days, so it is again an ancient bloodline, not merely of the body, but of the will, still resists the rule of the Most High. Every fragment of this story, every shadow before Genesis, every oath sworn on Mount Hermon, every chain fastened in the depths, has been preserved for one reason: to awaken us. This is not merely the history of a world long drowned or angels long imprisoned. It is the pattern of rebellion and restoration that still runs beneath our own age, waiting for eyes willing to see it. The fracture before Adam teaches us that the world we inherit is never as young as it seems. There are wounds in the foundation of creation, scars from battles we did not fight yet, whose consequences we still live with. The descent of the Watchers shows that authority, even in heaven, can be misused, and that proximity to the divine is no safeguard against pride. The flood and the chaining of the rebel host prove that God's justice moves through every realm, sparing no one who breaks his covenant. And the persistence of the Nephilim's shadow warns us that even decisive judgment does not end the war. We live now in a time between acts, just as Noah did when he stepped from the ark onto a cleansed earth. The stage is quiet, but not empty. The enemy has not vanished. His strategies have shifted. He works not only through open violence, but through distortion of truth, of time, of worship. The appointed boundaries are under pressure again, and the rhythm of the Creator's order is once more being drowned out by the pulse of human ambition. This is why the Scriptures call the final generation to vigilance. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The warning is not poetic, it is exact. The same conditions, the same patterns, the same temptations will rise again, and with them the same verdict. If we do not awaken, we will be swept away, not by water this time, but by a judgment that will remake the heavens and the earth forever. To awaken is to remember to reclaim the truths erased from common memory, to align ourselves with the Creator's appointed times and boundaries, to resist the seduction of forbidden knowledge and the allure of power divorced from righteousness. It is to live as Noah did, not flawless, but faithful, building in obedience when the world mocks, trusting the unseen warnings of God more than the visible assurances of man. The call is not to fear, but to readiness. The ark of our age is not a vessel of wood pitched with tar. It is the covenant sealed in the blood of the Lamb, the shelter offered to all who will enter before the final storm breaks. That covenant is open now. The door is not yet shut, but it will be. So we must choose. Will we live lulled by the false peace of a world repeating the errors of its earliest days? Or will we stand as witnesses to the truth, refusing to let the story be erased again? The flood, the chains, the echo of the Watcher's fall. They are not just relics. They are the trumpet blast before the last act begins. The call to awake is not for tomorrow. It is for now. For the patterns are already forming, the stage already set, and the author of history is turning the page.